Andrew Sanford. Andrew is asking, Hank, when you have a moment, might you be able to give a short explanation regarding the vindication regarding 1,000 years in Revelation chapter 20? Thanks. You know what I find interesting about Revelation chapter 20, Andrew, is in Revelation chapter 20, what's going on here is you have an angel coming down from heaven, having the key to the abyss and holding in his hand a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who's the devil or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss and locked and sealed it over him to keep him from deceiving the nations until the 1,000 years were over. After that, he must be set free for a short time. Now, think about what I just quoted. The language there is self-evidently metaphorical, unless you think you can bind a noncorporeal being with a chain and then throw him into an abyss and then have some kind of a cover that you can cover him with and thereby keep him confined. Well, if you take that in a wooden literal sense, it makes nonsense, because angels, again, are noncorporeal beings that cannot be bound with chains, but they can be bound. So my point here is we're dealing with metaphor. Metaphor, as I've said from time to time, has sharp teeth. And the metaphor is designed not to obscure, but rather to elucidate those things we might otherwise not fully understand. Now, the reason that's relevant to the question you're asking is 1,000 then in the most metaphorical chapter, in the most metaphorical book, should never be taken in a wooden literalistic sense. It ought to be taken in the sense in which it is intended. And the first way in which you do that is you read Scripture in light of Scripture, which is to say, in Scripture over and over again, in the Old Testament as well as in the New, 1,000 is used metaphorically. I don't know, Christina, if you can think of any examples of that. God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Or better is one day in your courts than 1,000 days elsewhere. Yeah, and God is going to increase the number of the Jews 1,000 times. Well, all of these are very clear-cut cases of 1,000 being used metaphorically, and if I had enough time, I could give 1,000 more examples. Well, that's an exaggeration or a metaphor. But the point here is simply to say that in a book, and then a chapter in that book that is self-evidently rife with metaphor, we don't want to take 1,000 in a wooden literalistic sense. We want to take it in the sense in which it is intended. And in a simplistic way of putting it, although this could be elucidated with a whole lot more passion and explanation, what's going on in the book of Revelation is the basic idea that the suffering of the seven churches, or the faithful within the seven churches in the province of Asia, will be such that they will suffer for a short time. Their vindication will be a long time. To use the biblical terms, you'll suffer for 10 days, your vindication will be for 1,000 years. It is an eternal vindication.
It's beautiful. The thing that I always remember is from what you used to tell me was he will come on the clouds, as not literally Jesus coming on clouds, but that's using the Old Testament as a sign of judgment.
Yeah, God doesn't ride a cloud chariot, as it were. This is a metaphor. So God comes on clouds to judge the nations in the Old Testament, and there are many examples of that. And that same language then used in the New Testament is metaphorical for judgment. So if it's used in that way in the Old Testament by the Old Testament prophets, Think about Jesus. He's the heir to the linguistic riches of the Old Testament prophets, and he's a far greater prophet than them all. He's using their language and now applying it as judgment language with respect to the nation that is saying that Jesus Christ, Messiah in their midst, is not God. He's coming in judgment. He's coming on clouds. And so again, it's metaphorical, self-evidently metaphorical, if in fact you read Scripture in light of Scripture.